So the topic for today is the executive branch. We're talking about the presidency. We have the vice president and the president here with us to work on this topic. The presidency is discussed in Article 2 of the Constitution. First thing I want to think about is in the United States, who can be president? Who can be president? And what it says in the Constitution, there are basically three criteria. And you see, you need to be a natural-born citizen, you need to be at least 35 years old, and you need to have been a resident living in the United States for 14 years prior to taking office. These are the only requirements necessary to be president of the United States. There is no previous experience necessary. Nothing required. Now, outside of BMCC, there was a diner around the corner from where the school was, and I used to go there sometimes in between classes. They had a sign in the window back a few months ago now, but they were looking for a cashier, right? And the sign said, cashier, looking for a cashier, must have experience. Must have experience. In order to be a cashier in a diner, you need to have had previous experience. To be president of the United States, no experience is required. The president is responsible for over 2 million federal employees. The president oversees a budget of more than $4 trillion. The president works with counterparts in every corner of the world. No experience necessary. You have these three requirements. That's it. That's it. The salary for the president is $400,000 a year, and the president's annual expense budget is somewhere in the neighborhood of $169,000, which includes travel, entertainment, that sort of stuff. And obviously you live in the White House, that's your residence. So my question to you was, if you met these requirements, if you got elected, would you want the job of president? I posed this question to you on the discussion board of our Blackboard page. Now, I loved reading your responses, and I look forward to reading some more. But a bunch of people said no. They said, I don't want the responsibility, the work is too hard, too much stress, the things I could mess up would be gigantic. One person, I love this, said, no, I want my parents to keep taking care of me. I don't want to have to take care of other people. That was beautiful. Somebody said, I can't be the president because I'm a woman. And I'm really pleased to say that many of your classmates said, wait a minute, and I'm with them. That is absolutely not a reason not to be the president. God willing, we will all live one day to see a woman be the president. But you guys had a lot of reasons why you didn't want to do it. But some people, a few people, actually said yeah, so that they would want the job. Somebody said, I would work really hard to try to move the nation forward. Somebody else said, I think I could get people to cooperate and work with me. And somebody said, I would take the job and I would seek to do my best. And somebody else said, of course, exclamation point, it's a dream job. I have to tell you, I completely understand those of you who said no, but those of you who said yes, warm my heart. And I would die a happy person if one day I could vote for one of my students, any one of you, to be president, or really any political office. But here's the question. The skills that you need to get elected to be president, the skills that you need to get elected, making speeches, raising money, going out and shaking hands with all these people, right? These kinds of skills, raising more money, are not necessarily the same skills that you need once you actually get the job, right? Once you get the job, once you get elected to be president, you're in charge of the whole country. You need a vision of how are you going to govern. You need to inspire trust in people, and then you need to come to the table and work with Congress, with governors, with foreign leaders, with all of the people. You need to figure out how to compromise and inspire trust. which are very different, like I say, than the skills that you need to actually win the campaign. So what I want to look at is, imagine the campaign is over, we'll come back to that in a few minutes, but once you have the job, I want to look at what actually is the job. And let's unpack that a little bit. So we're going to look at the 5 constitutional roles of the president. These are things that we actually find in Article 2. And I've tried to stick kind of closely to your textbook just so you can take a look at this stuff in more detail. The first role, constitutional role of the president is that the president acts as head of state. He or she plays a ceremonial role. This is on page 227 and page 228. And you can see from this photo that most recently, I guess it was last week, April 22nd, was Earth Day, right? And President Donald Trump, went outside and planted a tree at the White House. And there was a ceremony. This was a public ceremony that he dug, the shovels and did the whole thing, planted this tree. And in the course of making a speech while he planted this tree, he did a couple of things. He sort of gave great praise to the national parks, and he said how wonderful it is to be out in creation and all this stuff. But then he also said, our nation will be growing again soon. And so he was using this kind of metaphor of planting the tree and how this tree is going to grow and flourish, that the economy and our nation, which is now definitely stumbling along, will be soon flourishing. We also see that the vice president plays a ceremonial role. Mike Pence, right? That Mike Pence went to the Mayo Clinic, and what did he do there? He went on behalf of the executive branch, the administration, to say thank you to the doctors, right? This is an important message. Now, it created great controversy. Why? Because he wasn't wearing a mask. Now, this is an interesting exchange, what was going on. The administration was clearly trying to send one message and another one may have been heard, right? They were trying to say that, wow, Mike Pence is healthy, he's strong, he didn't need to wear a mask, but he also wanted to look people in the eye and say thank you. So what we see is that this ceremonial role, this is an interesting thing because these events, yes, they're ceremonies, but they are also used for the political benefit of the administration. And this is true not just with the Trump administration, every president does this. This ceremonial role, this head of state, is an incredibly important function because partly this is really what we, the people, see of the president. A lot of the other stuff that the president does is kind of a little more off-screen, a little more behind the scenes, but these events, these are the things that make the evening news. These are the things that you see on television, in the newspapers, and so this is the way we relate to our president. The second constitutional role that we see is that the president is the chief executive. Okay, he's basically like the CEO of the corporation. He's the chief executive of the United States of America. And as such, he does a number of things. One is that he enforces the acts of Congress, right? Congress creates laws, but then it's up to the executive branch to execute, to carry out those laws. Most recently, we talked about this the other day, the CARES Act has been passed, a number of them actually. Okay, it's all well and good for Congress to allocate a bunch of money to go to a bunch of different places, but somebody has to figure out how to get it there, to execute, to carry out this policy. That's up to the executive branch, to the president, right? It's also up to the president to enforce decisions made by the federal court system, right? The federal court system has decisions, they make rulings, but then somebody has to figure out how are we going to carry these things out. It was quite a controversial issue some months ago in terms of the census. Hopefully you guys all filled out your census forms. But there was a question, should we have a question about citizenship on the census form? Well, it was contested, it went to the federal courts. The federal courts said no. So it was actually up to the executive branch to write the census forms in such a way that it does not include the question about citizenship. They carry out, they enforce the decisions of the judicial branch. as the chief executive, they also have appointment power, right? That we see that the president nominates people for his cabinet. These are people that help him make his decisions. He nominates Supreme Court justices, and he also nominates somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 1,300 people who work very closely in the executive office. Now, the interesting thing about these nominations is that they require Senate approval. They require Senate approval. So at the moment, the Senate, as you know, is controlled by the Republicans. Our president is a Republican. So the nominations that our president makes generally are approved by the Republican Senate. In the last years of the Obama administration, this was a huge issue for President Obama, who was a Democrat, because he was nominating various people for various positions, and the Republican Senate was able to block a number of his nominations, significantly Supreme Court justice nominations. So this is another reason, and I know I keep pushing this, but this is another reason why these down ballot, other than president elections, are incredibly important, right? That we see who controls the Senate really has a significant part to play in who makes up the executive branch and whose appointments are approved and the appointments that are not approved. The final role that the chief executive plays, the final power that they have, is to grant pardons, right? And basically this is that somebody is released from their punishment. Okay. The third thing that we see in the Constitution, power of the presidency, is the commander-in-chief. Now this is an interesting thing, that the commander-in-chief, the president, is the supreme commander of military forces in the United States. What this means, and this is significant because this is not like a number of the countries that some of you come from, the armed forces are under civilian rather than military control. Okay, the armed forces are under civilian control. This is significant because what this means is that the military is held accountable by the civilians, right? That really the military ultimately answers to civilian control. This is the way the Constitution set it up. So, in terms of military power, what we see is also this power is divided. Congress has the power to declare war. That's a power of Congress, to declare war. But once military action has been declared, it is up to the president to decide how to deploy the troops, how to fight the war. So Congress declares the war, but the president decides how are we going to fight the war. So just a few examples. Your book lays this out for you. Harry Truman, during World War II, decided to drop the atomic bomb. That was the president. The executive branch made that decision as commander-in-chief. After 9/11, George Bush, the president, decided to invade Afghanistan, right? Donald Trump more recently has basically put Iran on notice after they test fired a missile, right? So it's up to Donald Trump to decide what are we going to do about Iran. So what we see is that the president is the ultimate decision maker in terms of military matters. So the next power that I want to talk about is chief diplomat. Chief diplomat. I like to think about this, that the president basically gets to decide who's invited to the dinner party, right? Who's invited to dinner? And if you're like me, you guys have probably been fantasizing about who are you going to have dinner with when you can finally get out and have dinner with somebody else, right? So this is a question. Are we going to have that first dinner with the people who have been so helpful in terms of bringing us groceries? Are we going to have dinner with relatives that we feel obligated to have dinner with? Are we going to have dinner with our dearest best friends who we want to see because we've missed them so much, right? Who are we going to have? And then when you have this dinner party, how are you going to set it up? Who's going to sit beside them, right? What are you going to serve? These are the kinds of things that we think about when we talk about this chief diplomat on a much bigger scale. So the question is, with the United States, it is up to the president to decide who's going to sit around the table. Who are we going to have relations with, and which countries are we not going to have relations with, right? And this is an interesting thing, and we see that particularly with the case of China, right? We see this with North Korea. We see this with various countries where the United States has to decide, how are we going to relate to these people? Chief diplomat, right? It's an interesting thing. So as chief diplomat, the president gets to decide who we will and will not have relationships with. The president gets to negotiate treaties with other countries. Interesting thing about treaties is that they require Senate approval. So if President Trump were to negotiate a treaty with a foreign power, that treaty would then have to go to the Senate to be approved. Now, it is also possible that President Trump could negotiate an agreement with a foreign power that would be called an executive agreement. And this, basically, he has the power to do that on his own. He does not, an executive agreement does not require Senate approval. So needless to say, this is often the path that the president will take, partly because it's much more expedient, it's much faster, and it's much easier to make that happen. Barack Obama, as I mentioned before, when he was a Democratic president with a Republican Senate, Barack Obama signed over 700, almost 800 executive agreements in the course of his presidency. Why? Because he couldn't get the Senate to approve a full-blown treaty. Right? So this is a tool that the founders actually gave to the executive so that sometimes if they need to do something quickly, they can do this, but also if they don't have the approval of the Senate, they can still move ahead. So the last one I want to look at is chief legislator. There are a number of ways in which the executive actually participates in the legislative process, right? The first thing, and we talked about this the other day when we talked about Congress, that the executive actually comes before the entire Congress, the Senate and the House, and presents a State of the Union speech. Okay? A State of the Union speech is exactly that, where the president lays out his or her legislative agenda. The second thing that we see the president doing in terms of the legislative process is using the power of persuasion. Okay? And it sounds like, oh, what's that? That's a big deal. If your boss comes to you and says, hey, I kind of want you to do this, even though you don't want to do it, chances are you do, right? And can you imagine if your boss were the president and the president was really pushing a particular piece of legislation, if they wanted something to happen, and they came to you and they said, I want your vote and I want you to get me a few more, chances are you would figure out a way to make that happen. The power of persuasion. And then the last thing that we see in terms of the president being inserted into the legislative process is that any piece of legislation ultimately ends up on the desk of the president. And the president has the ability to either sign, that is, approve this piece of legislation, thus it becomes a law, or they can veto this piece of legislation and basically it's killed. So those are the 5 roles of the president. Basically, if you want to think about it, that's the job description of the president of the United States, those 5 roles. So there are currently 2 people applying for the job. Donald Trump, who currently holds the job, and Joe Biden, who would like the job. But actually, there are 4 people, right? Because the president runs with a partner, with a vice president. And what's happening now, especially in terms of the Democrats and possibly in terms of the Republicans, but if we have the Democratic candidate for president, right? What the Democratic candidate for president is doing right now is trying to figure out who should be Joe Biden, who should be his running mate, who should be the vice president that works with him. And what we talk about is this idea of balancing the ticket, right? Balancing the ticket. Because we have Joe Biden, who is kind of a middle-of-the-road liberal. And so the question is, should the person who sits on the other side of the seesaw, should that person be a little more progressive in order to balance out this ticket. Joe Biden is a man, right? So should we have a woman, right? Joe Biden is from the East Coast, so should we have somebody from some other place? Joe Biden is white. Maybe we should have somebody who's not white, right? So this is the question. Basically, they're going to try to figure out, the Democrats are trying to figure out who would best balance this ticket. And that's really the struggle right now. And perhaps by the time I even release this video, they will have decided who it is that will balance this ticket. So the founders were looking for a way to create an executive who had energy, who could make tough decisions, could act decisively, who would have a clear line of authority. But the question was, how to elect this person, right? How to elect the president. They rejected the idea of popular election, where the people directly elect the president, really for two reasons. One, they didn't quite trust the people to make that decision. And two, they were worried that that would mean that the state that had the most people, the largest population, would actually have the most power. And obviously the smaller states didn't go for that. They also rejected the idea of Congress electing the president, right? Why did they reject that? Because they didn't want Congress to be that powerful, right? They wanted there to be equal branches of government. And so what they came up with was this idea of the Electoral College. And we're going to take a few minutes and try to figure out the way in which the Electoral College works. And what the Electoral College is a group of people who are electors, and the electors choose the president. Now, what happens is that when you vote for president, right? When you vote for president, you are actually voting for a list of electors. So if you vote for Donald Trump, you are not actually voting for Donald Trump. You're voting for that state's list of electors in the Republican Party, because Donald Trump is a Republican. If in the last election you voted for Hillary Clinton, you were not actually voting for Hillary Clinton, you were voting for the Democrats list of electors. So each party has a list of electors. If there's a third party, they have their own electors, right? And what you're voting for is the people on those lists, right? Now, the Electoral College has 538 members. The way this breaks down is this, that it corresponds to 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate, 3 people from Washington, D.C., comes out to 538. So in order to win an election in the Electoral College, it's 538 divided by 2. You basically need 270, right? You would need 270 votes to win in the Electoral College. So there are 538 members in the Electoral College. Question is, who has how many electors, right? So here's the way they figure this out. That basically the formula is this, that you look at the number of representatives a state has plus the number of senators a state has, and that equals the number of electors they have in the Electoral College. So let me just give you a few examples. New York, we have 27 members in the House of Representatives, right? We have 2 senators, so that means we have 29 electors in the Electoral College. If you look at the state of Montana, not a very populous state, right? They have 1 member in the House of Representatives, they have 2 senators, everybody does, so they have 3 members in the Electoral College. And then you see a state like California, gigantic population, they have 53 representatives in the House of Representatives, they have 2 senators, so they have 55 electors. So what you can see is that states with a larger population end up with a greater number of electors. So, like I was telling you, different states have different number of electors. Okay, what we're gonna look at now is basically there's 4 steps to someone getting elected president, right? The first step, obviously, starts in the voting booth, right? That what happens is individuals, people, us, hopefully you, go in and oops, there's already somebody in there. They go in and they vote, right? Okay, so that happens in November. That's the general election, right? Okay, after the general election is over and we see who wins the popular vote, we're gonna just talk about the state of New York, but it's the same in every state. That basically what happens is each party, the Democrats have their list of 29 electors. The Republicans have their list of 29 electors. So whoever wins the popular vote in the general election in November, those are the people, those are the electors. The other guys, go home. So what happens is in the beginning of December, after the general election in November, we have the Electoral College meets, right? And 29 electors, either the Democrats, if they won the popular vote, or the Republicans, if they won the popular vote, would be sitting around this table casting their votes for president, okay? And so this, and again, this happens in the state capitals of all 50 states all over the country. So we have these votes are cast, right? All the votes are cast. Okay, so these electors cast their ballots in the beginning of December. Wonderful. These votes are then gathered up, every one of them. Yeah. Okay, so these votes are then gathered up and they're sent to Washington. And they go to Congress, right? And in Congress is where they're actually counted and tallied, right? Now, I want to just remind you that the House of Representatives has also just experienced an election, right? Every single one of the members of the House of Representatives was up for re-election in November. So when you went to that little shoebox voting booth, you went and you also, in addition to voting for president, you also voted for a representative. Some of them are being re-elected, some of them will be new to the office. And these people, the newly elected Congress, then tally the votes and determine who in fact is president. Okay, we'll leave the final step, the inauguration, come back in the spring and we'll see what that's gonna be. But what I wanna do now is I wanna go back to step 2, okay? In terms of how these votes, this idea of winner take all and how these votes are actually distributed. So the question is, how does this work? How does the Electoral College work? First of all, I want to point out to you that it's a winner-take-all system, okay? And I want to give you an imaginary situation just to help explain this. So imagine there's a presidential contest between state number 1 and state number 2, okay? And what we have in state number 1 is 55 electors, 400,000 votes are cast. Of those 400,000, 210,000 go to the Republicans and 190,000 go to the Democrats, okay? State number 1. State number 2, 34 electors, right? 200,000 votes are cast. So what we see in state number 2, that the Republicans get 20,000 votes and the Democrats get 180,000 votes. So we see the popular vote, right? The Republicans have won 230,000 votes, and the Democrats have won 370,000 votes in the popular vote. So the question I ask you is, who won this election? Is the Democrat going to be president, or is the Republican going to be president? If we're having an election between state number 1 and state number 2. So take a look at this. Who won this election? Okay, the question is, did the Democrat win? Is the Democrat going to be elected president this year? The Democrat has 370,000 popular votes. Way, way more than the Republican has. But you know what? The Democrat did not win this election because what we're looking at is electors, right? And in state number 1, who won in state number 1? The Republicans. The Republicans won in state number 1. They won just barely, but they did win, right? Not by a great majority, but they won. So that means that the Republicans have 55 electors. They got 55 electoral college votes. If you look at state number 2, who won in state number 2? Well, the Democrats won in state number 2. They won by a landslide, right? 20,000 to 180,000. So they won by a landslide. But what did they get? 34 electors. So what we're looking at is that the Republicans, even though they lost the popular vote, right, they got a lot, way fewer votes than the Democrats did in terms of popular votes, but they got almost twice as many votes in the Electoral College. So the Republican actually won that imaginary race, okay? That's how the Electoral College works. That's why Hillary Clinton lost the race in 2016. Hillary Clinton received more than 3 million votes. Sorry, she received 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did, but she received 77 fewer Electoral College votes. So she lost the race. So what I want to look at now is just a few maps. I want to point out to you that these maps come from a really amazing website, 270towin.org. I would highly recommend that you take a look at it, just so that you can see what's going on in terms of the Electoral College. The first map that we're going to look at is the election, the presidential election in the year 2000. And I want you to notice two things. You see on this map that New York has 33 Electoral College votes, and you see that Florida has 25 Electoral College votes. Now I'm flipping over, I'm showing you a map from 2016, okay, the 2016 presidential election. I want you to notice that New York now has 29 electoral votes, and Florida has 29 electoral votes. New York lost 4, and Florida gained 4. What accounts for this change in numbers? New York is losing population, and Florida is gaining population. And as I said, that the number of votes you have in the Electoral College is based on the number of representatives, and this, as you know, is based on population. Okay? This, by the way, is one of the reasons that people push you to fill out the census forms, because this really affects the number of representatives that your state has. All right, I'm going to show you a couple more maps, actually 3. First, we're going to look at 2008. In 2008, we see that Barack Obama has 365 Electoral College votes. John McCain has 173 Electoral College votes. I want you to keep your eye on the state of Indiana, the state of North Carolina, and the state of Ohio. I want to shift now to the 2012 presidential race. Barack Obama was running against Mitt Romney. And you see that Barack Obama this time has 332 Electoral College votes, and Mitt Romney has 206 Electoral College votes. And again, notice the difference between Indiana and North Carolina. And finally, I want you to look at the 2016 presidential election. Donald Trump has 304 Electoral College votes, and Hillary Clinton has 227. Donald Trump won Ohio, he won Indiana, and he won North Carolina in the Electoral College. So what changed? What changed was that these states are what we call their swing states. These are states that swing from the Republicans to the Democrats, from the Democrats to the Republicans. And so these are states that we look to see how are they going to go next time, so that we can begin to understand who's actually going to be president. So the Electoral College is obviously incredibly complicated and confusing, and something that generally makes people really angry. The question is it a good idea or is it a bad idea? One of the important things about the Electoral College is that because it requires candidates to campaign across the country, right? Because you can't just win the election with a tiny small section of the country. So you actually have to expand your campaign beyond just these large, very populous states. This is one. So that might be a benefit. An obvious drawback is the fact that it is possible for a candidate to win the popular vote and not win the election. And so this means that a lot of people look at the Electoral College and say, okay, this is the reason that I'm not going to bother to vote. In fact, a lot of you suggested in your essays about voting that that's why you didn't vote. But one of your classmates pointed out that over 100 million eligible voters chose not to vote in 2016. She made the case, and I so completely agree, that if those people had in fact voted, it is very likely that the outcome would have been different, right? The outcome would have been different. Something to think about. I also want to remind you again that in the general election in November, you are not only voting for president. You are not only voting for president. That you are also voting for your senators and for your congresspeople, right? And that it is possible for the Senate or the House to either block or to push through the agenda of the president, okay? So, okay, you can say, I don't like the Electoral College and I'm not gonna vote for president. But that's crazy if you also don't vote for your senators and your representatives. Another reason that some of you gave for not voting, and this breaks my heart, is that you don't feel qualified. That you say, oh, I don't know enough. I want to say two things to you about that. First, you are an expert in your life. Nobody knows more than you personally know about the things that you need from the government and the ways in which the government can support you and your community. You're an expert in that. Nobody needs to tell you that. You don't need to do any research. You know what you need. Second, if you are watching this video, you are on the internet right now, and you can open a new tab and you can click on Donald Trump or you can click on Joe Biden, and in, I would say, 5 minutes, you can get some information about these two people and you can find out which one you want to vote for, because they are very, very different. And it's a simple thing, and like I say, you're on the internet, you can do it now. And you can do the same exact thing because, as I said, the House of Representatives are also up for re-election in November. And in your last assignment, each of you found out who your representative was. Again, put that person's name into your search engine and look them up, and in 3 minutes you can get some information to see whether or not you like them. So really, the fact that you would say that you don't have enough information, this is not a good excuse. Okay, the last thing that I want to say to you, and thanks for watching this video to the end, the last thing I want to say to you is that in my other video, I told you about the elections in New York in June, on the 23rd of June. Okay, things have changed. Things have changed. And some of those elections have in fact been canceled since I made that video. What I want you to do is I want you to look up a website called whosontheballot.org. It's a wonderful website that comes out of Columbia University, and there's tons of information on this website. It will tell you not only how to register to vote, but where to vote, and it will also tell you who in fact is on the ballot. So do me a favor and take a look at that website and see who's on the ballot. All right, thanks very much and take good care.